At the risk of losing half the audience, I think I should say straight away, given my topic, that it has nothing at all to do with Julia Gillard. But I think most of you perhaps will remember that the ending of the Cold War in the 1980s prompted really a great flurry of democracy promotion. And so it seemed that once the two superpowers didn't have to pour all their energies into battling each other in various forums, including the United Nations, the stage was then set for many more cooperative ventures. The end of the Cold War also appeared to have marked liberal democracy as the best possible form of government. So this allowed observers such as Francis Fukuyama famously to claim that we had in fact reached the end of history. And to quote him directly, we'd got to the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. So it was possible to make these very triumphalist claims at this time. So those were two features that led into the democracy building, but the fervour for democracy building was given even more oxygen by the attacks of the 11th September 2001. So US President George W. Bush switched from being a sceptic about democracy building. In fact, famously, his Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, had referred to democracy building in other countries as international social work. That was the complete put-down. But he switched very quickly to believing that democracy building in other countries was absolutely critical as a protection against terrorism. And he said in his second inaugural address, he said, "This is the urgent requirement of our nation's security and the greatest calling of our time." Strong words from the President. So this commitment to democracy building as a bastion against terrorism was enthusiastically endorsed by our own Prime Minister, John Howard, and Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. So we can think very readily of some examples where Australia was involved and where we weren't involved, but we can think of the UN intervention in East Timor in 1999, the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the invasion of Iraq and the intervention in the Solomon Islands in 2003, all as very different types of international democracy building. And last year's Arab Spring we could think of in the same light. Of course, it wasn't brought about directly by outside intervention, but we now see it very regularly analysed in the Western press, in the Western literature, as part of what's called the inevitable democracy tsunami that is sweeping the Middle East. However, as our newspapers remind us daily, almost all the countries caught up in this new wave of democracies have had really serious problems. They've been accompanied by an increase in insecurity, in unemployment, in crime, in corruption, and in lawlessness. And we can see around us political leaders are looking for dignified ways to escape some of these terrible morasses, leading to tactics that had long been rejected. For example, the move by the United States in the case of Afghanistan to negotiate with the Taliban, something considered absolutely out of the question, but now it's seen as one possible exit route. But those are all background. The problem that I really want to look at today is the one that I think that's been most overlooked in analyses of the pitfalls of democracy promotion over the last 20 years, and this is the situation of women. Now, although women have been in all these cases critical in agitating for political change, once the change arrives, it seems they very quickly become the losers in the new political dispensation. And one observer has nicely summarised this by saying, overthrowing dictators is much easier than overturning the pervasive supremacy of men. Now, just to take one example, we can see this very clearly in the case of Iraq. Women's rights were actually deployed as one rationale for the invasion in 2003. The idea was that if you get rid of a dictator, you build democracy, this would lead to much greater respect for women's rights. But despite this rhetoric, little attention was in fact given to women's representation in the new Iraq. And right from the beginning it was striking that the Iraq government in exile, which was created by the United States before the invasion, I was very struck by the fact that there were 3 women out of 65 members. And when the Coalition Provisional Authority, that was the vehicle that the United States used initially to govern Iran, there were finally 3 women out of 25 on the Iraqi Governing Council. And it was very striking that the United States, which of course initially led much of the democracy building in Iraq, was deeply ambivalent about the role of women, even though it had used the language of women's rights as one of the reasons to go in. It then was very reluctant to follow that through. And interestingly, in 2004, a group of Iraqi women's non-government organisations called for a 50% quota for women in the body that was going to draft the new constitution. And the main American players in Iraq said we cannot have quotas because this is inconsistent with United States anti-affirmative action policies. A very strange move to use US constitutional law in this context. Now, finally, when the Iraqi constitution was drafted in 2005, there are a number of relatively progressive provisions referring to women's right to vote and women's right to stand for election and so on. And it contains an aspiration, rather than a requirement, that 25% of the Council of Representatives, the Parliament, should be women. But it's very striking that despite these statements, the Constitution also has a declaration, a formal declaration very early in the Constitution, that Islam is the fundamental source of legislation. And this is quoting the Constitution: "No law that contradicts the established provisions of Islam may be established." Now, of course, the implications for women depend very, very much on the interpretation of Sharia law that's adopted, but and the appointment of judges to the critical court has so far been very, very conservative. Very fundamentalist religious leaders have been appointed to the court, and there's grave fears that the constitution, seemingly progressive, could actually be used to invalidate laws in Iraq that were adopted actually very early in 1959, which accord women equal rights in relation to marriage, divorce and inheritance. But much, much more significantly for women, I think the invasion of Iraq, we can see, and this was very clear from early on, has really replaced a secular regime with a government of strong religious affiliation. Rebel groups, too, are also characterised by a commitment to fundamentalist religion. And so it seems that the major protagonists in the very chaotic process of democracy building in Iraq are at best ambivalent and at worst openly hostile to the involvement of women. And of course, meanwhile, the terrible continuing violence in Iraq that's been unleashed has destroyed daily domestic security, leaving little space for women's lives. Iraqi women face huge systematic violence and discrimination, both outside the home, but particularly within the home as well. That's just one example. We can see a very, very similar picture in the context of Afghanistan. And I think now it's possible to say, over 10 years after the invasion, that it's done almost nothing for women's lives, leaving them in a very insecure and dangerous environment. Now, of course, there is a real irony here, because both the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, as I've said, were justified to some extent on the basis of promoting women's rights. And I still recall very, very clearly an extraordinary intervention that Laura Bush made in this debate in 2001, when she was actually allowed to take over her husband's weekly radio program. And she gave a talk before the invasion about whether the invasion of Iraq was a good idea or not. And one of the things she emphasised in that speech was that it was very important, she said, to promote the right of Afghan women to wear nail polish. It seemed an extraordinary and very slight type of right to invoke in this respect. But this failure of democracy promotion goes much, much broader than the Middle East. And we can take very close to home Timor-Leste, a country in which Australia and Australians have played quite a significant role. Now, as you're probably all aware, Timorese women were deeply involved in the 25-year independence struggle against Indonesia and had suffered many types of violence, such as rape and sexual slavery. But they've ended up effectively marginalised in designing the new Timor-Leste that became independent 10 years ago. So today in Timor-Leste, it's true that women make up 1/3 of the members of parliament, but otherwise women are very poorly represented in public life and in governmental positions. Domestic violence remains at extremely high levels, and women have almost no hope of economic freedom. The most recent report from the UN Development Programme reports that women receive less food than men in Timor-Leste, and that 1/3 of women between the ages of 14 and 49 officially meet the malnourishment indicators. Women's rates of fertility in Timor-Leste are the highest in the world, as are the rates of maternal death in childbirth. To go to another part of the world then, more recently in the context of a so-called Arab Spring, we can see too in that context that Egyptian women were really critical in the pro-democracy movement, not just last year but over the last decade in labour movements and so on before that. But they've been very quickly pushed back into the private realm of home, hearth and family. And it's striking that in the most recent elections, less than 2% of the seats in the new parliament will be held by women. So it seems that even though while the status of women is often deployed as a trigger for intervention and a rationale for democracy building, it seems to very quickly evaporate as a serious political issue. Well, why do women fare so badly in democracy building projects? I want to propose 3 reasons. The first one is that women are simply not involved in democracy design. Think of all the negotiations in relation to Afghanistan or the Arab Spring, and we only ever see men involved in that. It's very striking, for example, that in Libya's National Transitional Council, the so-called the liberators there, there are 2 women among 61 men involved in the negotiations. Now, this is often explained as due to the need to get combatants at the table. So you have to get the combatants at the table, and of course these are largely men. But this seems a very, very narrow way of understanding the roles of women. Now, the United Nations over 10 years ago adopted a very significant resolution, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which committed all countries to ensuring that women participated in peace building. But when we look at the way that resolution has been sidelined, it seems an example of what's been described as the United Nations AAA syndrome with respect to women and peace: apathy, ad hoc practices and amnesia. We can see, just for example, if we're just looking at the number of people appointed by Secretaries General to the point of mediators in conflict, that when Kofi Annan left office barely 5 years ago as Secretary General, he had 18 special representatives in conflict areas, none of whom were women. And Ban Ki-moon, the current Secretary General of the United Nations, who's appointed many, many more such mediators, he has 41 of them. Of those 41, 4 are women. So that's the first issue. Women are simply not involved in democracy design. A second issue, I think, for women is that women's interests are typically bargained away for political support, and claims of culture are used as trumps against women's rights. So we can see this, for example, in East Timor, where the idea of women's traditional roles in the home, which pervade East Timorese society and which have been supported by the deeply religious East Timorese society, have allowed leaders, particularly Janana Guzmão, to resist greater engagement with the lives of women. We can see this also in the context of Iraq, and as I've said, there's some irony because actually under Saddam Hussein's authoritarian and dictatorial rule, women actually had many more rights in Iraq than in most other parts of the Middle East. But the 2003 invasion of Iraq has allowed, among other things, really an assertive masculine traditionalism to reclaim authenticity and authority. And I think for Iraqi women, they seem to have lost all their gains. Now, we also see that in this context, control over women's bodies is often a feature of masculine cultures manifested in new democracies. So in order to assert their independence, we see women's bodies often becoming the battleground. And a nice example of this is the law adopted by Afghanistan in 2009. It's a law on personal status, which requires Shiite women to obtain a male's relative's permission to leave their house, to seek employment employment or education, and requires them to accede to their husband's sexual demands. This law was adopted by Hamid Karzai's government to gain the support of the Shia community, even though it clearly violates Afghanistan's international human rights commitments. But at the same time, we must be aware that the language of women's rights can sometimes be appropriated by authoritarian governments. So, for example, in Egypt, Suzanne Mubarak, the wife of the deposed dictator, used the discourse of women's rights to enhance her international status. The third reason, I think, for this, the problem, is that a very crude model of democracy is used, which associates democracy with Western-style institutions. So most models of democracy that are used in the West and by international institutions really focus on elections as the ultimate democratic goal. And stability is given much greater priority than social justice. So in the last 2 minutes, I then want to address, well, if these are some of the problems, what can we do about it? So my 3 prescriptions for what we can do about it echo the problems that I've just identified. First of all, obviously we have to insist that women are at the table when democracies are being designed. It shouldn't be acceptable to negotiate the terms of democracies without women being involved in equal numbers to men. I think we should insist that our own governments support peace processes abroad only when women's voices are heard equally with men's, and that international organisations, of which we're a part, take their commitments to women's equality seriously. I think this may require quotas, a very, in some ways, flawed and problematic strategy, but it seems to me it's critical in the short term in this area. Secondly, I think we have to be very sceptical about claims of culture in the context of women's rights. I think we really have to, every time a claim of culture is raised to, as it were, defeat a claim of women's rights, we have to start asking questions such as, well, whose culture is being invoked? In whose name is the argument advanced? Who's going to win and who's going to lose by that claim of culture? And finally, I think we've got to change the way that we understand the idea of democracy. We have to understand it as much less about institutions, particularly Western-style institutions, and much, much more about relationships and justice. So the Western tendency really, and this happened very much in Timor-Leste, is to turn up with a list of institutions that every democracy should have and start building the buildings for those institutions. A huge focus on elections in that context. It seems to me a much richer understanding of democracy, which was formulated by the political scientist David Beetham, says, no, we should think about democracy in a different way. It's actually based on 2 principles. First of all, popular control over collective decision-making, and secondly, equality between citizens in exercising that control. So popular control over the collective decision-making and equality between citizens in exercising that control. Now, of course, they're very general principles. They'll translate in different societies in many different ways, and it seems to me they'll be most powerful when linked with local forms of democracy rather than imported models. So I hope that these 3 proposals that I've very briefly sketched will go some way to enable women to ride the new waves of democracy and to be empowered by them, instead of being drowned by them as the waves crash.